All right, let's get started. We have an exciting panel of speakers today and lots of interesting topics to cover. So welcome to this panel on best practices for the use of low-cost sensors to expand air quality monitoring coverage in the urban environment. The session is being pre-recorded as part of the A&WMA ACE 2021 conference, which starts next week, and the recording will be shared on the website. There is still time to register for the conference, which starts next Monday, June 14th, if you haven't already on their website. Hello, everyone, and welcome again. My name is Mei-Ling Gao. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Clarity Movement. I'm here with my colleagues, Ryan Higgins and David Liu, who will be helping me run this exciting and hopefully educational panel. We'll have the first half of the session devoted to presentations by our panelists, and then followed by a Q&A session. Thank you again to our audience for sending in some great questions in advance. You can also send questions during the panel at any time using the Q&A box. So an exciting lineup of panelists with us today that have significant experience setting up and running different types of air quality sensor networks in urban environments. We have Dr. Gary Fuller, who's an air pollution scientist at Imperial College London, and Michael Ogletree, air quality program manager with the City and County of Denver, and Dr. Grace Lewis, who's senior health scientist with the Environmental Defense Fund. Our audience today is quite diverse and global. And Ryan, do you have the poll results from the beginning of the webinar? Great, and it seems like 41% of you guys in the audience are already running your own low-cost sensor network. We're really hoping to see these numbers increase over the next few years. And as a brief introduction to Clarity, we provide turnkey environmental sensor solutions to governments, communities, and industries, and work with partners to deploy our air monitoring solution in over 55 countries to date. Many of these projects are large-scale networks, and in the process of deploying these networks, we've experienced challenges and gained some lessons learned that our panelists today have also faced, and we'll discuss more in detail. So to set the stage for our panelists, what is the current state of low-cost sensor technology? So using the technology adoption curve, we think about what type of user groups are currently using low-cost sensors right now. As adoption of this technology increases, the usage of the technology is expected to move from left to right on this diagram. So we have the innovators. They're usually the first to take action and adopt a technology, even if it's buggy. They're risk takers and can help shape the product. They're usually just a small percentage of the population. And then next on the curve, we have the early adopters. They understand why low-cost sensors are important and tend to be seen as leaders and can help inspire more people to adopt the technology. In the early majority stage, low-cost sensors will start to get more traction and field users are looking for useful solutions, but also are still wary of possible technology fads. And in the late majority group, they tend to adopt the technology only after seeing a lot of demonstrated success. So we're expecting rapid adoption with more low-cost sensors installed by 2025, according to a recent market study. And the US GAO report also highlighted the role low-cost sensors could play in modernizing the air monitoring network across the United States. And recently, the US EPA also released sensor performance targets for PM2.5 and ozone, which can help users select and test sensors within this rapidly growing market. So there really is a shift towards standardizing how we use these sensors. Ryan, do you have the results from the poll? Great, seems like 57% of us in the audience think that the low-cost sensor market is currently in the early adopter stage. So hopefully having more of these discussions around challenges and best practice and how to run the network and use the data to improve air quality can help push the adoption curve further to the right. There are obviously many obstacles in how we manage air quality right now, and insufficient data is one of them. Low-cost sensors can help fill in some of these gaps, but there are also challenges with running these networks, including calibration, QA/QC, maintenance, and how to appropriately communicate the results of the data. So that we're still learning how to overcome many of these challenges. But at the same time, there are significant opportunities for low-cost sensors to change how we measure and engage with our environments. As some of you already know, there are many steps in deploying a network and many steps that happen upstream even before getting a sensor into the field. And there are many steps to maintain the network to make sure that the data collected are reliable and useful of the lifespan of the network, whether that's 1, 5, or 10 years. So there are challenges at every step, but some of the lessons learned from the existing networks out there can help smooth the way to build more robust and reliable networks in the future. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Gary Fuller, who will talk about his experience and lessons learned thus far from the Breathe London network in the UK. Gary, over to you.
Hi, May. Thank you very much, May, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. I wanted to share with you some of the early lessons from the Breathe London project. This is something we've been working away on now for around the last 6 or 7 months, so it's very much in its early days. So at Imperial College London, and you might have heard of us before when we used to be located at King's, we as a university department have been running London's air pollution measurement network. It's sort of regulatory network, if you like. And one of the things we've always emphasized all the way through the last 28 years of doing this is getting information out to the public. So we were early innovators in terms of web pages. We have widgets that people can embed our information. We do alerting that ends up on bus signs, and we have apps and things as well. And the whole idea of this is to try to make sure that air pollution measurement is not something that's remote from people, but is something that they can see, something that they can connect with. Next slide, please. So about 6 years ago, we were involved in a European project called A&WMA just on the periphery. And what this was doing was trying to look at a future of urban air pollution networks in major European cities. And we published this new directions paper. And it envisaged a number of things, for instance, bringing together modeling and measurement at the city scale involving epidemiologists and health impact assessment. And on top of that as well, what we also envisaged was using the regulatory network as a test bed for other instrumentation, such as small sensors, and ways in which we could try to embed smaller or lower cost instruments within the regulatory network to improve its density, to improve the granularity of the information that it's able to provide, and to connect it better with citizens. So that takes us very neatly in my next slide to the project that we started at the beginning of the year called Breathe London. This isn't the first incarnation of the Breathe London project, but it's a new version of Breathe London. It's a partnership between the Mayor of London, Imperial College, Clarity, of course, who are here, and Bloomberg Philanthropies, who are participating in the or supporting the community connection part. And straight away, you can see from our webpage that we're trying to do something different here. This isn't the normal web page you would find from an air pollution measurement network. What we're trying to do is to make this approachable, and we're trying to make this in ways that connects to communities and people. And if you look very carefully at the cartoon here, you can try and count the number of clarity nodes on the lampposts and things. I think there's about 6 to be spotted. Next slide, please. So what we're trying to do here uniquely with this is we are approaching the network in 2 ways. The first thing we're trying to do is very closely integrate sensors within a reference measurement network. And the whole idea here is to reduce measurement uncertainty. And the second thing we're trying to do is, rather than this being a top-down network that comes from City Hall and is directed on the people, what we're trying to do is make it as bottom-up as possible. Next slide, please. So what we're trying to do, as I say, is closely integrate the low-cost sensors within our reference network. We're working really tightly with our equipment partner, Clarity here, who have extensive experience, as you'll all know, of small sensor solutions in large cities. quite like that. And we have a core network here of 135 Clarity nodes that are being funded by the London Mayor. And then we have an additional community nodes and research about the way in which the community actually use these nodes that is funded by Bloomberg. We're also opening up the network such that anyone, be it community groups, be it businesses, be it individuals or parts of local government, can actually buy into the network themselves, which is a unique model, certainly for the UK and for London. If I can have the next slide, please. So one of the challenges, of course, with all of these small sensor networks, and many of you describe yourself as early adopters, and I'm sure you'll be well aware of these, is the QA/QC. So what we're trying to do here is to go a little bit further than the normal use of co-locations. So we're doing two stages. The first is that all of the Clarity nodes that we deploy out there in the field, as shown in the left-hand panel, are co-located for a period in a suburban location in London so we can characterize them. Then in our second stage, what we will be doing, or what we already are doing, is we're deploying a number of nodes at around 20 locations in the city next to our reference measurement sites. And we're going to be using this second stage to provide a real-time specific correction going forward. And we're hoping to be able to really get the uncertainty down by doing that. Next slide, please. So how well are we doing? I don't know if everyone's familiar with this, but within the EU, there is this concept of assessing sensors by looking at their measurement uncertainty when compared to a reference instrument. And there's a couple of slides here that show how our first stage corrections are working. If you look in the left-hand panel that shows nitrogen dioxide and the right-hand panel shows PM2.5, the orange boxes, box and whiskers, show the uncertainty from the instrumentation when we're just taking them out of the box and using them. And I should put here that we're not using any of Clarity's correction algorithms. This is just simply straight out the box. And then how our first stage correction mechanism takes us down in terms of uncertainty to the sort of teal colored box there. So importantly, what we're able to do is to get below the so-called indicative threshold, to be somewhere in terms of uncertainty between the indicative and reference threshold. We're hoping that stage 2 will take us that bit further. Next slide, please. So we're also deploying these out there. The initial deployments have been going out to hospitals, to schools, and you can see a few of the it's kind of play spot the node really. In this one, there's some attached patriotically to the flagpole at one of the hospitals, and you can see some other hospital deployments, and then on the right hand side you can see node deployed at a primary school. Next, please. So what are we looking to use the data for? And I think we have to be careful here in terms of how we encourage the community to use these types of sensor. And we've got a number of use cases here that we're suggesting to people. So the first is community awareness. I think if you can begin to measure something as a group of people, or you have measurements from your locality, then it increases awareness of the air pollution problems. We can encourage them to ask relative concentration questions like, when is air pollution good or bad? And so, for instance, many of the schools that we're rolling out to do programs like Walk to School Week and things like that, so we can find out, does that change anything? Does parents dropping the kids off at the school gate, what does that affect air pollution? We can ask those types of questions. And also, we're putting data in real time on the website so that communities can not only be more aware of their own air pollution, but they can be aware of it in the wider context. Next slide, please. Okay, so that really brings us to the end, but really we can't build this, we're not building this network on our own, and I'm certainly not building it on my own. So there's a huge number of people who are involved in this, and I'd just like to give credit to them all here now. On the right hand side here, there's some contact details for us if you want to follow up, and I encourage you, if someone could pop it in the chat, please. There's a very nice hello video from Breathe London, and you can have a look at what we're doing in a just 2-minute little VMA. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gary. We're super excited to see how this hybrid network approach of combining reference sites and low-cost sensors can work together to improve air quality in the Greater London region. Next, I'd like to introduce Michael Ogletree, who will discuss how the city and County of Denver in Colorado is integrating various sensor platforms and working across agencies and groups to improve air quality in that region. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, May. So my name is Michael Ogletree. I'm the Air Quality Technical Services Program Manager in the City and County of Denver, and just wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about our air monitoring network and how we've evolved it over the past couple of years. Next slide. Here's kind of an idea around hybrid networks and kind of the different reasons for doing that, right? So looking at regulations, there's some research going on in the area, community concerns, basically using different types of instrumentation to solve different types of problems and coming up with a way to do it using a diverse set of instrumentation and bringing that all together to be able to make better sense of it. Next slide. So here's a little bit about how we kind of expanded our network. We have limited funding in terms of a city budget, but we were able to increase our city budget over the past couple of years, just as there's been increased interest in air monitoring. So also through grants, we have several grants from EPA, FHWA, we have a pretty big grant from Bloomberg Philanthropies, which I'll be talking a little bit more about, but also kind of leveraging other city partners and different projects, and also kind of working through regional collaborations on bringing and expanding the air monitoring that we're doing, not only within Denver, but in the larger non-attainment ozone area for the Denver region. Next slide. So here's a kind of visual over the past 5 years as to how we've kind of evolved. So from the left to the right, you can see kind of more of an innovative approach and using kind of these lower cost sensors and different types of technologies. But basically over the past 5 years, we've gone from, more traditional ambient air monitoring stations, more traditional filter-based samples, slowly evolving to kind of where we are now, looking at different types of sensors, as well as some mobile devices and different apps to get the information out to communities. Next slide. So here's a little pilot we're doing with some of these lower cost sensors, but kind of trying to use them to figure out how to identify different odors and different odor sources. So here on the right, you can see a map. In the orange dots, you can see kind of different potential sources of odors in this area. And in the blue dots, you can kind of see where we've deployed some of these odor sensors. So these devices measure H2S, NH3, and total VOCs, and kind of looking at those different readings to kind of give you an odor intensity. So it's a collaboration with multiple municipalities, but just one of the types of sensors and projects we have networked in our system here in Denver. Next slide. So this one's another kind of pilot, kind of looking at total VOCs and using them to try and measure impacts from industry. Here we're using PIDs to measure total VOCs, and then we're trying to figure out ways to use that information to capture summa canister samples to better speciate and identify sources and how those could potentially impact our communities. Next slide. Here's where the arrows are a little bit off, but here's a good example of how we address some of the community concerns in near real time. So up here on the top right, you can see a picture of the Black Lives Matter movement. So what happened here was that at the time, if most of you guys remember, there's a lot of events going on, demonstrations at capitals across the US. So for us, there was some concern around the use of dispersion agents, things like flashbangs and potential like impacts on local air quality. So what I was able to do was grab some clarity nodes and put them up really quickly and be able to measure that air quality right away, which was super useful in trying to identify those impacts to our community members. The next three kind of horizontal pictures are actually quite relevant. So on the very bottom, you can see a construction site. And that's actually going on right now. So what they're doing is they're demoing an elevated viaduct. And on the bottom left, you can see, it's the sites are within feet of local residents. And in the middle graph, you can kind of see some of those spikes, right? So as high as, close to 200 micrograms per cubic meter during some of those demolitions. And after this webinar, I'm going to go deploy another 4 clarity nodes around the job site, just so that we can make sure that we're monitoring it accurately and in near real time, so that we can go out there and do things like enforcement measures based on construction that is impacting local residents as a result of air quality. So really timely in terms of how we can actually physically go out there really quickly, put out some sensors, make some measurements, and then use them to enforce upon some of the requirements we have here in terms of fence line, dust, and impacts to communities. Next slide. So here's a little bit about the Love My Air program. It was co-developed with parents, teachers, and nurses. And what it is, it's a distributed sensor network that's deployed at public schools across the city and county of Denver, and then using that information to better inform those communities on mitigation strategies, as well as strategies for reducing exposure to poor air pollution. Next slide. This program is really community facing. So, we're out there regularly kind of, looking at the data, trying to get education out to those school communities, educating nurses, parents. So right here, you can see we have sensors out at schools. Right now, we're at about 35 schools as of the end of this last school year. We have dashboards, so we can put all the data into the system, use correction algorithms to improve the data, and then put those data out to dashboards within schools where students have access to that information to better inform how they're protecting themselves around poor air quality. We also equip nurses with toolkits and have what we've created as a menu of options so that each school can tailor their mitigation strategies to what suits them as a school community. And then on the bottom, you can see an app. So that app we've been developing over the past year, partly because of COVID and not being able to have easy access to that information and data. We created an app and we'll be releasing a beta version at the end of this month. And then we'll be releasing it into the App Store in an additional month. So having the ability to give real-time data access to our communities, as well as different strategies for reducing exposure to air pollution. Next slide. I think the next one's my last one. So here's just the most recent version of kind of what we're doing. So we're kind of working as a region to aggregate all of the data and then be able to give that data out through a dashboard to communities. So as you can imagine, as you're going from municipality to municipality, data sets are disjointed, as well as state data. So even if you're trying to look at state data and purple air data in any region, you have to go to 2 different sites. So here we're aggregating all of the data, not only state data that's available via AirNow, as well as purple air data, which is publicly available, but then also kind of working on all of these different projects, like the Love My Air network will be in there with its 40 sensors. And then, if our Department of Transportation is doing monitoring, or a state department's doing some other monitoring using low-cost sensors, kind of working as a region and as a state to be able to create a bit of an open data platform and portal for access to and uploading of all air quality data across the state of Colorado. So with that, my next slide is just my closing slide. So thanks for the time, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Michael. We're excited to see how the regional collaboration on air quality data in Colorado comes together. I'd like to introduce our final panelist, Dr. Grace Lewis, who will provide a community-based perspective on how communities are using low-cost sensors in the Houston, Texas region.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me today on the panel. I'd like to just start by, next slide, please. In case any of you are not familiar with the work of EDF, this is our mission statement: to preserve the natural systems on which all life depends. And so in doing so, we work with a multitude of different types of organizations, including the grassroots community groups, academic partners, businesses, Clarity, and government. Next slide. So I'd like to start my presentation today with some background information about Houston, just to give you some context for the work we're doing in my presentation today. The Houston, Galveston, Brazoria, or HGB region is comprised of 8 counties, and we have about 7 million people living in the Houston area. Demographically, we're a young city, and some people say that Houston is what the United States will be like in the future, a cosmopolitan mix where there is no racial or ethnic minority. A majority, excuse me, majority. It's an international city with more than 145 languages spoken, and nearly a quarter of our city's population is actually foreign born. We have the largest medical center in the world, yet among major metropolitan areas, we lead the nation in percentage of people uninsured. And the American Lung Association ranks Houston among the most polluted cities in the US for ozone and annual particle pollution in ambient air. So as the energy capital of the United States, Houston is home to one of the largest petrochemical complexes in the world. More than 400 chemical plants produce 40% of the nation's basic chemicals in the Houston region. And 2 of our country's 4 largest refineries are located along the 52-mile Houston Ship Channel, which extends about 4 miles east of downtown. So due to historical policies of redlining and decades of environmental racism and a lack of zoning, people of color and low wealth are commonly living in neighborhoods heavily burdened by industrial facilities that are clustered close to their homes, schools, and work places of worship as well. So while Houston meets federal requirements for the number of reference grade air monitors and has more than many metropolitan cities in the US, they still have very few in number, and typically they're not located in areas where we can measure and understand residential exposures. So communities that bear a disproportionate cumulative burden of air pollution, they need that scientific evidence to advocate for improvements in their neighborhood. And citizen science and low-cost sensors can help in these efforts by empowering community leaders to engage with their local agencies, showing them the air quality data to demand change. So this first slide shows our first deployment of Clarity sensors in Houston as a result of the tank fires in Deer Park in March of 2019. They were a series of explosions with multiple facilities in the area, but this fire in particular, the ITC fire, burned for 3 days and caused schools to shut down and some portions of the city to shelter in place. So we worked with the City of Houston Health Department, a local HBCU and School of Public Health, which were our academic partners, as well as community leaders and residents who lived closest to the plume to deploy 20 nodes across our city. And we placed them in fire stations, near hospitals, schools, and then the backyards of residents to measure particle levels, particle pollution levels, PM 2.5 in particular, that were of particular concern to residents regarding their health. And it provided data from many parts of our city that lacked air monitors, where the plume was visibly being dispersed. And one thing I would say is that the solar panels and cellular transmission capability of the Clarity nodes really allowed us to be agile and useful in the rapid deployment in this situation. Next slide, please. So next, I'd like to share information about the first community-owned and operated network in our city. This is a collaboration between Achieving Community Tasks Successfully, or ACTS, and Texas Southern University, our local HBCU, or one of them, that is, EDF, with complementary support, obviously, and engagement by Clarity from the onset of this project. And just to give you some background, you'll see from that map that Pleasantville is about 2 miles from the Houston Ship Channel. It is a community of about 3,000 residents, mostly African-American with some growing Hispanic population. They contend with transportation-related traffic from major freeways, rail at 2 entrances of into their community, marine activity, trucking, warehouses, as well as several Superfund sites within a mile of Pleasantville, including a former chemical storage facility over the fence line to a senior living apartments in their neighborhood. So their community really, they identified a need to address the poor air quality in their neighborhood and their health concerns as a priority. And so this led to working with us. We got a grant, a diversity and justice grant, to develop their community air monitoring network. Next slide, please. So they held community meetings to define the objectives of their network and their monitoring program, which pollutants were of concern. We helped them do asset mapping to identify the amenities and sources close to their community which were of concern, in an effort to consider where to place those monitors. They use participatory action research techniques to get input from the residents on final placement of the nodes to the community. So you'll see on the far right that we put a big map on the wall and allowed people to place stickers as a way to vote on where to place the monitors. We also had residents do the installation of the monitors, and they continue to maintain them over time. And Pleasantville has also installed a weather station to collect meteorologic data for them to understand where are the prevailing likely sources of the measurements that they're reading coming from. So we're going to continue to work with them to try to understand those factors. But key to this project is collaboration with the city's health department. They assisted us with co-location of a node at a regulatory monitor to calibrate their network. And we helped identify a graduate student who works with the community to analyze that data and generate reports to help educate and communicate the air quality to residents. And periodically, we reviewed that data from their community network to communicate with the city and request reference grade equipment and additional monitoring when we do observe patterns of high readings, as the data from this low-cost sensor network actually cannot be used for enforcement or compliance. However, the collaboration with the city health department is critical and has really been welcomed by the community. Next slide, please. So this is a slide of the different locations of the nodes, including the picture on the left, which is the air monitoring trailer, which you've seen in other slides from the other presenters also, where our one of the nodes is co-located for calibration. And I won't take the time, but you can just see the different various locations at entrances in the central part of the community, as well as close to schools and the community center, which is very centrally located, and over the fence line close to a senior living facility apartments in the neighborhood. Next slide, please. So my last slide is really to show one application that we feel has been really successful, and we're hopeful for the outcome of this, which is in the 2021 state air monitoring plan. The state proposed citing a reference grade monitor in Pleasantville. We are hopeful that, you know, all of the work that we've done has helped kind of push that forward. We use data actually they open up a comment period, and so we help drive comments in support of placing that reference grade monitor in the neighborhood. And in doing so, we use data from the Clarity Network to show the differences in air quality in the neighborhood compared to the closest reference monitor. So on the left, you'll see that time series graph, which is really showing that measurements in the city close to a school typically read higher than what is being observed at the reference grade monitor, and these were calibrated to that monitor. So this type of data really shows that communities can be empowered, and it gives them the ability to use science not only to educate their residents, but also in their advocacy efforts to really use data to make it actionable to meet their efforts to try to improve air quality and the public health of their residents. So I'm happy to take more questions in the panel, but thank you for your time.
Thanks, Grace, and thank you for all our panelists for their presentations. Now I'd like to move to the Q&A session. Please feel free to submit any questions you have in the Q&A box. And a reminder to panelists that you can also respond there directly as well. I can kick it off with a question talking about how to design your network and select your monitoring sites. What information should you collect when designing a network to ensure that sensors are sited at the optimal location? And did you include community members in this conversation? If so, how? And I'll direct this question first to Dr. Lewis. There was a question from the audience specifically asking how you did the siting in the Pleasantville project.
Sure, absolutely. So as I mentioned, we did that participatory action type of activity. So we created a map of the neighborhood, and we also went through the effort of asking to map the amenities and disamenities. So mapping has really been a critical portion of this, marrying it with the input from the community groups. And so we had residents say, you know, where are all the things that are positively contributing to your community, as well as where are the potential sources. So for instance, those old EPA you know, sites, the Superfund sites that are close to the border of their community, maybe it was trucking routes that are close to coming through the periphery of the community. So the idling trucks in that community, for instance, and how they're affecting the air quality to close to streets that that were at the entrance of the community. And so the mapping exercise really was critical in trying to identify both the amenities and disamenities. And then, as you remember, I had that map that showed all of the dots. And so people would add in where did they think things were not included or missing on the map, and we would add them to the maps. And then they ultimately, we had a series of meetings, and they could vote so that pre-pandemic, of course. And so this is something that we've had to learn to do virtually, because we have another community group, another portion of the city where we're having a second air monitoring network, and they've had to do that virtually, which makes it a little challenging, but we still were able to achieve the mapping and the voting for people to collectively decide where to site the monitors. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Grace. Any insights on that, Gary or Michael? On sensor placement or how to design your network?
Yeah, you know, kind of our network is built and developed in a way that is there for community concerns, right? So kind of networking everything together as projects come up. So one of the first projects was around a highway reconstruction. So we put a monitor there. You know, most recently, as of today, they're demoing something. So we'll put sensors along, you know, community fence lines to be able to measure the impacts there. So, I mean, I think taking community feedback and input and concern and using instrumentation that would provide data that would meet those concerns is how I would suggest most people build their networks. Just, as things come up where you want to learn more about what's going on, I think it's a useful way to grow your network.
If I could just say, in London, we're trying, we're rather new in the Breathe London network, but initially what we're trying to do, London has 33 sort of municipalities that look after the different portions of it. So initially we're working with them to help us identify the communities that they're working with. And in a second phase, we're going to be opening up a competition whereby people can apply through a relatively simple process to have a node allocated to their community. And we're then looking to work with social science researchers around this to see how the community actually uses the node and to see whether, let's say, it empowers greater understanding or, exactly what change having those local measurements makes.
I'd also like to add one more thing, sorry. Kind of focusing for us, a big focus has been on, most vulnerable communities, looking at disproportionately impacted as well as environmental justice communities, and making sure that those communities have some monitoring, because we do know that they are disproportionately impacted.
And if I could also add that the community also considered the placement close to sensitive receptors, meaning specifically schools, parks, hike and bike trails, and the senior living facility apartments that are in their neighborhood, because they wanted to prioritize making sure that the most vulnerable in our community, in their community, were also having close measurements that could, if they needed to give alerts to stay indoors because those sensitive populations, the air quality was poor, they wanted to have that as an objective, to have that communication for health concerns. And these are bluebonnets, by the way. I saw the chat.
Thank you so much for that. I know we're limited on time, so I want to move to another very popular topic, which is on calibration and QA/QC of the data. So like any monitoring infrastructures, these networks need to be calibrated and maintained. What are some of the QA/QC checks and calibration processes that you're implementing on your sensors and the data at the start of the network, and how are these done over the lifetime of the networks? And Gary, I'm going to start with you on that one, because there was actually a question from the audience asking for more details about the step 1 and the step 2, stage 2 calibrations.
Yeah, so our stage one process is to do what I suppose you could regard as good practice everywhere, which is to co-locate the nodes before deployment with reference instrumentation. And from that, we're able to work, well, initially we were just looking at simple linear corrections between, let's say, reference and node NO2. Now we're looking at being able to use other predictors in a sort of multilinear model, things like relative humidity, ozone in the prevailing area. And so that's really our stage 1, is to get that as best as possible. Our stage 2, we're then trying to implement real-time corrections. So for instance, in our 6 months, we've seen times when there are episodes of volatile particles. Europe suffers from these, and I'm sure your areas do as well, a lot in the springtime because of the agricultural use of ammonia fertilizer. But it's very difficult for these small sensors to actually detect all parts of the particle composition. So this is an ideal time for which you would be able to apply sort of a network correction, knowing that the nodes are systematically missing a proportion of the semi-volatile PM out there, for instance. But that's very much a work in progress for us at the moment.
Thanks, Gary. Michael or Grace?
Yeah, so all of our sites are linked together through a common platform, and the methodology that we use was actually developed in collaboration with researchers from CU Boulder, including Ellen Considine, who I believe is on the call. And what we're doing is we have a permanent co-location at 3 FEM sites looking at different particle characteristics, and then we do a 3-week look back on that. A 3-week look back historically, and we actually update that algorithm nightly. So we take into account temperature and humidity, as well as obviously the particles. But then having a dynamic calibration allows us to, look at, basically updating the algorithm nightly, and being able to account for changes in, seasonal variations of particle composition, as well as temperature and humidity. So it's kind of an ongoing calibration.
And
Great, thanks, Michael.
I would say that we've taken a similar approach of trying to co-locate all of the nodes with the regulatory monitor for a month prior to their deployment, just to see their performance node to node, as well as to have one permanently co-located at the reference monitor so that it calibrates the network. And I will say that we also, the community is extremely thankful to Clarity's collaboration with us, because they have helped develop a calibration curve when we have done some QA/QC checks on the data, just monitoring it to try to see, what is the error, because, obviously at concentrations that are very low, the amount of error that low cost sensors, like there's just a limitation in the ability to measure. And so working with Clarity to help develop these calibration curves to help reduce the amount of error and to be able to detect spikes. That was a real concern to community residents, because while they may not lead to like a 24-hour like going over the limit for the 24-hour EPA standard, we do see these long, really high spikes sometimes. They may be happening in the evening or on weekends and whatnot. And so the community then would have the ability to, because of Clarity's help in the calibration curves, have a more accurate understanding of those spikes. And we were able to quantify, for instance, how often those 1-hour spikes happened when we gave comments to the state TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, of how often those spikes were happening in the comments to justify the need for a regulatory monitor in their community.
Thank you so much for that. I know calibration and QA/QC could be a whole session by itself. We got to move on given time limitations. So on to communication and use of the data by the public. So there's inherent uncertainty in the data produced by both low-cost sensors and even the reference instruments that are out there. How are you managing and communicating these uncertainties in the data to the public, especially if the audience isn't technical? You want to start?
Shall I go? I think we do an appalling job at this in terms of both the regulatory and all types of air pollution measurement. I don't know how it works in the US, but in the EU and the UK used to be there. We have laws that says that, for instance, 40 micrograms NO2 annual mean, and that's it. If you're 41, then you're over, and 39, then you're fine. And that just doesn't respect the inherent uncertainty at all. And I think it's done quite badly everywhere, both reference and otherwise. You should really think about areas when we're comparing with, legislative limit values where we are sure that something exceeds or sure that it meets it, or we just simply say we're in the zone in between. But our legal structures don't allow that at all. When it comes to lower cost sensors, I think there's other challenges as well. And currently the UK methods don't allow, the mandated methods don't allow low cost electronic sensors to be used for regulatory assessment. So I think a better way to frame this is in terms of talking to communities about is what questions can they answer with these things, rather than the things that, focusing too much on the uses that we shouldn't put them to. So for instance, with schools, we're saying things like, how much does the school run increase the nitrogen dioxide outside your gates? What are the most polluted places? Maybe if your sensor's moved, but really what are the most polluted times? And we're looking very much on getting people to think about relative changes and relative differences rather than absolute ones. And I think that's a far more appropriate and informative use of these types of technology.
I think Gary, I think you hit it on the head. And I also think, additionally, I think how they can be used, for instance, for this monitoring project or this construction project that we're going as an indicator, right? If we're looking at ambient and it's, let's call it 10 micrograms per cubic meter, if something spikes to 150, like we know something's going on, right? And in our case, we could use that to, immediately be able to send out inspectors and, put in regulatory methods for, citing construction sites. In our case, it's, visual. So you actually have to have someone out there anyway, but we can certainly use them as indicators to be able to go out there and make those, regulatory type assessments impacts. Yeah.
Just in response to your point, Michael, separate from this Breathe London project, we've been doing a lot of work with lower cost sensors around construction sites. And we think that, given the type of material that comes from construction sites, quite big particles, then it plays to the strengths of low cost sensors. And we've set up systems with real-time alerting such that the construction operator and the people that have to inspect them are told when these peaks arise. And we've also worked out a system whereby you can set a threat by looking at ambient data when we're pretty sure that a threshold has been reached, that it's coming from the construction site and not some other source. But it's a great use of these sensors that plays to their strengths, I think.
Yeah, I would say also that in the community settings that we are using them, they're actually excellent ways, indicators to have that conversation when we see patterns, because that is particularly what the community is doing, is where are we seeing patterns? Is it night times, is it weekends, and in what parts of the community? So are they close to the railroads or to where trucks are being idling and things? Are they close to the freeways, or are they concerns because there's construction going down the road there? So I agree that those the placement and the thought of where they're located helps really make it meaningful in communicating to our city local officials to try to then bring about more reference grade monitoring into the community based on the data that they have provided. But I will say that also and part of that question is communicating. And so visualization of data is extremely critical for residents, because sometimes they are not digging into what the counts are and this and that. And so being able to link the measurements to the air quality index, for instance, as a communication tool is fundamental to understanding, okay, well, the air quality has gone like this in this afternoon range, and so people should go inside. There's been talk about using a flag system, which then, the students at the school would raise and lower a flag, colored flag, to be indicative of the air quality in the community, to just be a visual alert also, in addition to some of the graphics that you can produce and put on a website. So I think that visualization and integrating with more pragmatic understanding of what the air quality measurements really means and how it impacts health is fundamental.
Thank you so much for that.
You're exactly right, Grace. One of the best examples of that, rather than building on the flag idea, is a cafe that was set up in London for a period called Pea Soup Cafe. And they served different colour and different recipe soups according to the air pollution that was prevailing at the time. So, when thinking quite clear soups up to really green pea type soups at the higher end.
That's awesome. We need that.
Absolutely brilliant.
That's great. So moving on to Gary, to your point earlier about, we often focus on sensor uncertainty, what these sensors can do. What are examples of these sensors? What are the sensor networks actually enabling in the communities they're used in? And can you provide some examples of actual positive change resulting from the data that the networks are out there right now, whether within the communities or at the policy level?
I think it's really tough for communities to be able to persuade regulators or perhaps city authorities, or we've got a national environment agency, that there is a local problem. And often small sense data like this just really, really is often dismissed by regulators. I love your idea, Grace and Michael, that you're saying about, this data being used to help people to know where to cite regulatory measurement networks, but often that's not really the question. It's about a community trying to say, look, we have a problem here. I know it doesn't really relate to the types of small sensor that we're discussing here, but diffusion or palms tubes, which I'm sure most of you have come across for nitrogen dioxide, are allowable in the methods used for local air quality measurement in the UK. And one of the best examples, and one of the few, I think, in the UK that I know of, is a small village in to the south of London who are really concerned about the main road that passed right through the middle of their village. So what they did was they actually went and looked into the government manuals and followed exactly the routes for siting palms tubes around their village, and they spent about £300 on these and set out doing a community measurement program. It was done by a marvelous bunch of seniors. I don't think any of them were less than 70 years of age. And at the end of their 1 year, they were able to show that nitrogen dioxide in their community was considerably above the 40 micrograms per cubic meter. And because they've followed the exact methods in government guidance, the local authority and regulator responsible for that area had absolutely no choice but to accept their results. But that's one of the few I can think of where, where let's say measurement that's done outside those done by the regulatory authorities or municipalities is actually had an influence on policy. And I think that's a challenge going forward. How do we make best use of these data, and how can they be heard by the regulatory authorities?
Michael or Grace?
I would say, gosh, sorry, I'm like off on and on this one in terms of use of the low-cost sensors for regulatory networks, May.
Or just positive changes, examples of like where actually the data from these networks have been able to bring about some kind of benefits to the community, whether it's within the community itself, bring them together, or even on the policy levels.
Yeah, so sorry about that. Thank you for refreshing my memory about that.
No problem.
I would say that they have definitely, the community has seen the power of this participatory interest and action by its community leaders. And so anytime that, there's a fire or some sort of industrial event, they look to these networks to try to understand how it's impacting their health. And so I think that's a really positive initial impact of just increasing education and awareness. But certainly, I think that also this campaign to support the location by TCEQ, our regulatory state agency, to cite a reference grade monitor, we didn't feel like it was on the radar at all. And then it was included in the air quality monitoring plan. So every time we request a co-location, it has to be reviewed and approved by the state. And so hopefully that contributed to the awareness of the need for more reference grade monitoring in EJ communities. But certainly I think that education is, to me, the greatest initial benefit in raising awareness, and then how they're using this to then advocate for asthma programs and education in their schools and with the residents, I would say is the initial first greatest benefit. And I think that it will continue to build from there, because as we gather more data on how spikes and other things that we observe in the community, which are not being observed in other parts of the region, are occurring in frequency, I think that will then be a mechanism for advocating for policies to try to address those disparities, environmental disparities that are existing.
Thank you so much. I know we're at the end of our hour, but we're going to spend by a few minutes. We can ask our last question. So how and where do you see kind of low-cost sensors fitting into the air quality monitoring networks of the future? Might be difficult to answer in the last few minutes, but I wanted to get that out there.
I mean, I think it's a good question. I think, you know, as kind of I talked in my talk, right? I mean, I think everything's evolving, right? You know, and I think low-cost sensors in particular can help fill in so many gaps in monitoring networks. And I think they could help inform, especially with some of the new methods that people are using through data fusion to, you know, I think South Coast is doing this a good amount where they're taking not only reference data, sensor data, but also satellite data and fusing that all together to kind of help inform, you know, more at a more granular level about air quality. And I think the sensors are a good way to kind of fill in those gaps in terms of ground level measurements. And I think as time goes on, we'll see more networks and more collaboration, you know, putting networks together like we're doing here in Colorado, so that we can very systematically increase the amount of data that's available for at least, I want to be sensitive. I don't want to say regulatory use, but use by regulators to inform how they see air quality across a larger region. And I would add that we're not a regulatory agency. So it's one of the things where we're, you know, helping fill in the gaps for the regulatory agencies in the area.
And I would add that we would love to see a combination or proliferation of low-cost sensors with regulatory grade, reference grade sensors, so that, you know, we could build a network of kind of like indicators or a sentinel system that, just like what Michael had mentioned earlier, could then, you know, be an alert, so to speak, to see that if we're having spikes that are out of the ordinary happening, that you could then complement that with reference grade monitoring, because obviously you cannot use these low-cost sensors for enforcement or for compliance activities. And so it has to be that complement where you have kind of like a screening and creating a distributed network, in my opinion, especially when you have vast portions of a large metropolitan city where there are no nodes and reference grade equipment is so expensive, that you could then deploy a mobile lab or something to then validate whether those are actually occurring, and utilizing that as a complementary system to help provide information or background data for residential exposures.
I'm really excited to see what difference it will make in a community by people having their own local results. At the moment, communities, we often frame, well, I often frame invisible air pollution as an invisible killer, and we often say it's because of its invisibility that we haven't dealt with it so far. And just for a community to be able to say, look, down there by the school or outside the shops or in the park or the playground, this is when air pollution is worse. What difference will that information make? And I think that's really, really exciting. I use the analogy, I was talking to May about this yesterday, about my dad, who he's nearly 90 now, but he makes measurements of rainfall in his garden, and he moves his rainfall gauge around so it doesn't leave a mark on the lawn, and so his measurements are nothing that a meteorologist would really recognize, but he writes them all down diligently. And then when you talk to him, he actually takes ownership of this. He will say, oh, look, the garden's been getting really dry because I've only had, he measures in inches, 3/8 of an inch of rain in the last 3 weeks or something like that. And just him having that data gives him some sort of ownership and connection with the process. And I know perhaps that's quite a trivial example, But, you know, I'm just really excited to see what difference it will make if schools and other communities can actually have a readout of the local data. So I'm excited by, if you like, the bottom-up possibilities of this rather than the top-down ones from a regulatory or city governance perspective.
Thank you so much for that, Gary. I think on that note, you know, the idea of putting these low-cost sensors into the hands of communities really can help change how we engage with our environment. So that's very promising, very exciting. So we are at the end of our webinar. So to wrap up, I'd like to thank all our panelists and our audience for participating. Hopefully you've been able to gain some useful insights and the practices that have worked for our panelists in running a sensor network, some of the challenges we're still facing, and the potential of these networks and what they could bring to the next evolution in air quality monitoring. So we'll be sending out a follow-up email with links and resources after this event, and we'll also be planning other webinars as well. Clearly, there's still a lot of questions to be answered, and each of these topics that we touched on could be a separate webinar on itself. So please stay tuned and have a great rest of the day, everyone, and thank you again for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.